Hello, today is March 29th, 2007. My name is Amy Laity. We're at the Genoa Branch Library in Genoa, Ohio, and as part of the library's participation in the Oral History Project Northwest Ohio Narratives, I'm going to be talking to Mr. Jeff Eversman about the G.A.R. Hall here in Genoa. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Amy.
May we record this interview?
Sure, I'd be happy to do it.
And I understand you're going to tell us about the G.A.R. building here in Genoa. And first of all, what is the G.A.R.?
The G.A.R. stands for the Grand Army of the Republic. It was the political and patriotic organization after the Civil War, made up of the veterans that served from 1861 to 1865.
What was the purpose of this organization?
One of the purpose was to maintain the remembrance of the veterans and their service to the country during the Great Rebellion. Also, they took care of the widows and orphans that were left from the soldiers that did not come home. And also they worked on the behalf of the soldiers to get their pensions from the government.
So did they do fundraising activities?
They did fundraising activities, and with their allied groups, the various women's groups that supported them, they had summer picnics and lawn fetes where they would actually collect money and then donate that money to charitable means that they needed to put it to support whatever they were on.
Were there chapters in every Union state?
To the best of my knowledge, I believe there were chapters. I know Ohio had a lot of chapters.
And they weren't really called chapters, were they?
No, they were actually called post.
Well, there's a military significance to being called a post, or?
It's, well, I'm not actually sure, but I think there is a military being a post.
Do you know how many posts there were in Ohio?
725, of which today there are 5 remaining posts that have any connection to the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And we're just fortunate enough to have a building that actually had Civil War soldiers in it.
Where was the next closest post?
The next closest post to here would have been in Elmore or in East Toledo with the Ford Post, and I believe the one in Elmore was called the Troutman Post. And they all also have numbers. It was 14 there, and I think it was somewhere after 39 was in Elmore.
So what was the number here then?
39.
39, okay.
And there is a list on the computer that has all the names for Ohio Post and their numbers. And each, as they came in, they received a number as they organized.
They were active politically?
Extremely. Extremely. They actually ran the country for 60 years. You didn't seek political office until you went to the grand old army men and received their blessing. With so much conflict and so much they gave to preserving the Union, they wanted to make sure that it was in good hands throughout the rest of their life after they came home from the war. And they indeed, if they said no, you might as well forget it, your political career was over. If they must have had a unique ability to attract people to come out for their occasions, especially Decoration Day, which is now Memorial Day, because the crowds along the road were anywhere from 6 to 8 people deep. And today we have a lot of difficulty getting people to come out for Memorial Day.
How did one become a member of the G.A.R.?
There's only one way that you could become a member, and that was to have served or been in the Merchant Marine. Those were the only 2 ways. It was a completely inclusive group, and they realized that.
So any branch of the service?
Any branch of the service, which in those days was the Army and the Navy. They didn't have the current branches that we have today.
Does anything of the original G.A.R. still exist?
There are monuments that still exist, statues with their monuments, and there are buildings that they built and inhabited. Close to here would be Sandusky with the soldiers and sailors' home at Sandusky, where they spent their remaining years, and there's over 2,000 buried in the cemetery out back.
So the soldier and sailor's home is a direct result of...
It's an absolute memorial to the Victorian time period as well as the Civil War time period.
Now, the G.A.R. died out with the last veteran, is that
Albert
correct?
Wilson, who was 109 years old, and he passed away in 1956. The last G.A.R. encampment nationally was in 1949 in Indianapolis, Indiana. And then it was kind of in flux for a few years. It was still in existence because he was still alive. But to be the last man of a 3 million man army must have been an extremely lonely feeling for him.
So the Union had about 3 million?
That actively served during the
Did the
conflict.
South have a similar number?
Less. I don't know the exact number, but they did have less. And after the Civil War, I think at the height in the 1890s, there were some 400,000 that belonged to the Grand Army of the Republic. Not every veteran served. Not every veteran belonged to the Grand Army of the Republic, just like today, not everyone belongs to an American Legion or a VFW post. Some people don't want to remember that period of time in their life, and others just revel in that glory of the days of fighting.
What are some of the organizations that have grown out of the G.A.R.?
Well, most of them are the most important were the Sons of Union Veterans. There were the Son of Veterans. The Union Veterans Union were as an early patriotic organization, and it took two of those organizations, the Sons of Veterans and the Sons of Veterans Union, that combined to form the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. We've been around since 1881 and are the legal heirs to the Grand Army of the Republic by an act of Congress in 1954. The veterans knew that upon the death of the last member of the Grand Army of the Republic, they would rely on their sons to carry on the remembrance of the veterans, and also to make sure that their graves were properly decorated at Decoration Day.
Do you know about how many men from Genoa served in the Civil War?
It appears that we're still compiling names, of course, but it seems like there's at least 45 to 60 that were drafted right from Genoa. Then afterwards, so the one thing that you have to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of research for your local G.A.R. post is that you have the men that locally served and then the people that moved to your community after the Civil War. And there was a major immigration afterwards to new areas because some people just weren't content to go home to that little village or hamlet. They wanted to strike out for new areas, and so they moved from the east to west, and we were considered almost west at that time, and they were looking for new opportunities.
Many men from this area served in the 14th Ohio Volunteer Infantry.
Mm-hmm.
How is a group like this assembled?
You mean initially upon
Yes.
its inception?
Yes.
Basically, out of religious or patriotic fervor, they just, one man may just take it upon himself to go to his friends and neighbors and say, they're not going to do this, we're going to organize. As did, I'm thinking to jump over to a kind of a brotherly regiment, the 67th, which was another regiment that came from this area. Hyatt Ford, he went around and got his friends and neighbors and associates, and they formed Company B of the 67th. And the captains in each regiment, each company, which would have been of 100 men, it was a vote of that company in order to elect you captain. And then when you had 10 companies, then that would be 1,000 men, and that would be considered a regiment. And then they would appoint a colonel for that regiment.
So the officers might not necessarily have formal military training?
Well, the upper echelon did, but they may not be from your local area. the military itself. You get the volunteer soldier, and then you get the professional soldiers, and they would have appointed once you went up. But usually your captains were local men, and usually it was based on popularity, or that you actually organized or did something wonderful for the company.
So when there's the word volunteer, those were all men who
Yes.
gladly enlisted
Initially.
initially.
And that was the initial 100-day army, and they thought the conflict was going to be over in 1861 within that 100-day period. They thought it was going to be nothing to lick those rebels, but it didn't turn out to be that way. The one thing nice about the 14th that you ask about is they were one of the first regiments that were ready upon Lincoln's call for the men early in the war. So it's quite an honor for Toledo to have, in this greater northwestern Ohio area, to have 14 soldiers here.
The Mr. Ford that you mentioned earlier, is that who the post in East Toledo was named after?
Yes, Hyatt Ford.
Hyatt Ford.
He's really he was also a horticulturalist before the war, and I think he's my favorite soldier. But I don't know, Elliot Wyman from Genoa tends to be high on my list too, so.
Well, let's talk about Elliot then. Now, the post in Genoa is named after him, correct?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Charles Elliot Wyman, and they affectionately called him Elliot. And he seemed, from all the reading I've done on him, to have been a good-looking guy that had quite a personality, and people were attracted to him, and he was able to be a recruiter and come back here to Genoa and recruit local boys to go off to the war with him. He was an interesting man. He was the first one in his family to go to war. His brother Charles, I'll take that back. Frank left first, then Elliot. Elliot stayed home at first and stayed with his parents and tried to finish up paying off some of the debt on the farm here in Genoa and getting things organized. And Frank went off to the 14th. Elliot followed with Company G of the 100th. It was quite a debate at first of who went first, but we finally figured out who went off to war.
In reading some of Frank's letters, he refers to Copperheads. What were Copperheads?
Copperheads were Democrats. I hate to say that, but they were Democrats at the time that wanted to sue for peace and split the nation in two. A lot of them were headed up by General McClellan, who he was a wonderful military man, but he always saw the enemy as having twice the amount of soldiers that he did, so he was so absolutely cautious that he never fought. Lincoln once asked him, General, do you mind if I borrow your army? He had to do something to get the campaign underway. The general always had a reason why he couldn't fight. And later he did run against Lincoln, and he did lose, and the 14th really overwhelmingly supported Lincoln in the 1864 election.
There is quite a remarkable record of Genoa soldiers through the letters of Frank Wyman.
Yes, very nice.
Can you tell us a little bit about the compilation of those letters?
Well, the letters are Frank's war experiences from 1861 to 64. He notes in there everything about the battles, the conditions that he was living under. Still, while he was fighting, he was asking what was going on in Genoa, Ohio, kind of who was in love with who was seeing who, business things to do with the farm. And then as he gets into 1864 in August, Elliot is killed in the Battle of Utoy Creek, and you can tell there's a definite sadness in Frank's letters that he's lost his brother. And everything seems to change a little bit in the letters at that point, but he really does end up nicely at the end with that last paragraph where he says that after the war was over, he merely came in the back door and asked his mother what needs to be done, and she said the cows need to be milked, and she was fixing supper, and off he went to the barn, and the war was over for him, which is just an unbelievable way to wrap up 4 years of such a exciting but yet dreadful experience.
Was he one of the founding members of the G.A.R. post here in Genoa?
Yes, one of the founding members, and also to Frank's credit, the town hall that was built here in 1883, he was one of the main agitators for the town to build the town hall here in Genoa, which it's a beautiful building, and we got Frank Wyman to thank for that.
And as a tribute to his brother, they named the post.
Yes, and there were a number
Elliot
of
Wyman
men
Post.
that not only belonged to the 14th, but the 100th. And so it was just, since Elliot was so well liked, it was just natural for them to name their post after him. And our local Toledo Blade reporter that just wrote that nice article for us, she summed it up better than anyone ever has, I think, that that building here in Genoa is a living memorial to Elliot. And I felt it, but I could never put it into words like she did, and I thanked her for it, to let us know or to bring it upon us that that's a memorial in its own right to Elliot, and it's nice that we're working to preserve that building.
Do you know the names of some of the other Civil War soldiers from Genoa?
Yes, you have Hugh Boland, Sam Wood, who was later the Ottawa County Sheriff. You have Henry Dreyer, now related to the Myers family. You have the Boland brothers, or several Boland brothers, Warners. I believe there's 3 brothers with the Warners, and Famuel, he has a strange first name as far as pronunciation. I believe he lost his life in the book that Frank wrote home just shortly before the Appomattox Courthouse in '65. And then we've got Adam Long, you've got Amos Hassan from the 67th. There's a Shifford in there. Let me think of some of the other boys. Van Tynes. It's just countless who's who families in Genoa are represented in that
Yes,
list of names.
Some familiar names today in that list. Well, Genoa was not a big town at that time, so it's amazing there were so many from this area in the
Well, that's interesting
service.
that you say that because it factors into the whole G.A.R. Hall and its formation. At the time, with Genoa being founded as a village in 1868, there were very few large buildings. So the school board had in their school buildings all the various churches and social organizations in the town meeting in the schools. The Clay Township Board of Education passed a rule in 1868 that they could no longer hold any meetings in school buildings other than funerals and school-related activities, and that they would actually fine a group for being in possession of a school building for their meeting without authorization. This kind of presented some problems. I'm sure if the G.A.R. Post was being organized as where are they going to meet. And then it so happened that they were going to replace the building up here in Genoa on 4th Street. And so they sold the building off, which was a one-room schoolhouse. And because of Frank Wyman and Leander Gregg being in business and having a little bit more money, I think they were able to purchase the building and have it moved down to their land, and that's how the Post actually got its early beginnings.
About what year was that?
Right after 1868. We have a handbill that was from the possible 1870s announcing a Masquerade Ball at the G.A.R. Hall on February 25th of that year. And so we've pieced it back together. So it's one of our earliest pieces of Post history that we have.
So the Post was already in existence before they purchased the hall.
Yeah, I would say they were probably just in an organizational state at that point and needed a home. And so when the building came open, they were lucky enough to be able to get it. Not every Post had a building. A lot of posts around Ohio had a rented facility, and we were lucky enough to have our own building here in Genoa. Many times, the local inhabitants would also supply a G.A.R. Post just out of pure patriotism and thank you for serving in the war. They would give them things that they needed, other local veterans, in order to help them out.
So they had varied activities in their halls then.
Yes, not only the observance of Decoration Day, but dinners. They, had Sometimes people would give a paper on a specific battle that they were in, or they may have a visiting officer from another post in the G.A.R. world, or you may have a former military man that would come and be part of your meeting and relay his experiences to you. And I'm sure that was all very exciting to be able to relive those days that they all went through.
How long was the building used by the G.A.R.?
It appears here in Genoa from 1868 till the May of 1925. And in this May of 1925, Amos Hassan, the commander, passed away, and there were only 3 G.A.R. men at that time still left in Genoa. Keeping in mind that those are 3 G.A.R. men that belonged to the organization, there were still a few more Civil War veterans here at the time, but did not belong to the organization. So because of their rule, you had to have 3 members in a town to continue your charter. Genoa did not, and at that point they had to surrender their charter back to the state, and they officially closed it in May of 1925. At that time, Frank Wyman made a train trip from his home in Los Angeles, California, and came back for the funeral of Amos Hassan, and also helped do the final ceremonies in closing the post. But the building didn't completely close at the time because we had the Elliot Wyman chapter of the auxiliary that was there, the Women's Relief Corps, was using the building, and they used it till roughly 1964. So the artifacts and everything still were, the muskets were still on the wall, the pictures were on the walls, and it carried right on. It just didn't have the G.A.R. men there, other than they did come for meals afterwards. The women would cook dinners, and if it was Washington's birthday or Lincoln's birthday, it was a special occasion, and the men were always invited and treated as a really honored guest.
So the purpose of the WRC was to continue to provide support for...
They did all of the, of course, I think the women probably did most of the work, it seems to me. And I'd have to say these days, it seems like it's the way it's always been for some reason, but they did. They made the meals. They probably did a lot of fundraising also for widows, orphans. They also gave flags out to the schools and made sure that patriotism was, kept alive and well, especially flag etiquette. They were very big on that. And then they properly maintained the memorials and the cemetery stones for the soldiers. And then this particular post, the WRC, which is the Women's Relief Corps, won the Decoration Day in the 1920s. They made over 168 pine bough wreaths to put on the graves. So think of the work that must have taken to twist all that material around.
So that closed in 1954?
1964.
64. So what has happened to the hall since then?
Well, after 1964, what we've been able to put together is a history that the hall was used by some Girl Scouts here in Genoa, had a few meetings there. We had a few political meetings there from the various political parties. There were a couple of union meetings there. As people have stopped and visited the halls, they told some of their stories about being in the building. We've got a number of people that have mentioned that they saw the muskets on the wall and the pictures. And then I guess there was a sale, and the muskets and other memorabilia from the G.A.R. period were sold. We have not been able to retrieve any of that at all, other than one picture of the G.A.R. men in 1895 standing along the town hall. It's probably that day after they did their morning patriotic exercises. And at that point, the village started to use the building as a repository for Christmas decorations, bed for World War II, just a lot of debris that was stored in there. And luckily it was, otherwise it may have been torn down and it was gone. So the building has kind of gone through history, and nobody really at one point knew who owned it. It never seems to have had a real title of ownership. It's just sat there, and everybody's known it as the old school or the old Grand Army Hall. And that memory had pretty much faded away in town. It was just remarked as the old school. And to think that the G.A.R. men were actually there and actually educated their children there is quite remarkable for us.
Can you describe the building for people who might not be acquainted with it?
As you step through the front door, there is like a coat room, the old coat room in the front, which is across the complete front of the building. And then you take one step down into a large room, which was where the blackboards were. And we really think that the bottom shelf of the musket rack was actually the old chalk tray. The building is timber framed. It has the wooden pegs in the ceiling, and the structural engineer said that it is more like a church timber framing than a barn timber framing, which he said you really have something here. And at the end, he pronounced it very structurally sound, which was good for us.
So what are the plans for the G.A.R. Hall today?
Well, yet this year, our plans are, and we're working at this right now, Ellen Bergman's heading this up, we're going to have the building lifted and moved over 10 feet and back, I believe, 20 to 27 feet. Currently, if you step out the front door and you're not watching where you're going, you're right on Washington Street without even realizing. So we'd like to have more of a front yard and put it on a new foundation because right now, with the gravel that's around it, it's sitting in somewhat of a bowl, and during periods of heavy rain, the water wants to flow under the building. So we want to get it up and have a nice place where we can landscape it, maybe have a Civil War tent out there, and maybe some dulcimers playing on the front lawn. Right now we don't have, only about 4 feet.
Why was the post moved to that spot?
Well, in 1903, Leander Gregg, who was the town postmaster and friend of Elliot, and also served with him in the 100th, was climbing in a tree on 6th Street and actually fell out of the tree quite accidentally and lost his life as a result of it. At that point, Mrs. Gregg, I believe, decided to start selling off some of their holdings. And so the area that the post was sitting in was right behind Berman's store on 6th, which was adjoining the Gregg home. And the Wymans had land there at the quarry right across the street at Washington and 6th Street. And so with Berman's store being built there in 1905, Mrs. Gregg sold off that piece of ground, and so the post had to lift its building one more time and move it down the street to the end of the street, which actually gives it a nicer look. And so it's been sitting there for almost 100 years. The one thing that I've noticed, and I want to document this more, but the men that wanted to make sure that the Union was safe after the war, it's ironic that their memorial halls and their posts are within sight of the town hall, seat of current government. So the grand old Army men with those long white beards, I mean, they kept a close eye on government by meeting right on top of where the government is actually exercising its power. So I'm going to be interested in other communities to see if the G.A.R. memorial halls are in close proximity to the town halls.
There's an organization in town called Preserve Our Post. Can you tell us how that group got started?
Well, in 2003, the American Legion Post here in Genoa wanted to remove a platform that was used for Memorial Day at Clay Township Cemetery. It was a concrete structure that was built on bricks, had a platform with iron bars around the top, and it had become completely in disrepair, and they wanted to remove it. Well, to get permission to do that, they checked the records and found out the ground that it was on was owned by the Grand Army of the Republic. Well, because of that act of Congress, it was left to us in 1954 as our national organization, and so they needed our permission in order to remove it off of that site. So they said, now where are we going to find the Grand Army of the Republic? It's been gone for a long time. Well, somebody said something and said, well, I know that Jeff likes the Civil War and he's in the Sons of Union Veterans, and that made the connection. We helped the post. We went with our state officers, and they gave them a written document that they were able to remove that and erect their new American Legion Memorial, which is absolutely beautiful, and we're really proud of that. And they've actually have a bench there with all the veterans' names from Genoa on the bench. And also it says James B. McPherson Camp, Sons of Union Veterans, which my organization is, and we're really proud of that.
So you became involved through your participation in the...
Yes, and out of this whole thing, someone said, well, we had Phil Wyman, Frank Wyman's great-grandson, who lives in California, contacted someone here in town, and he had the old letters that we spoke of and some other ribbons and G.A.R. memorabilia, and he said that there was a G.A.R. building in Genoa. Well, hearing about it and not having been to Genoa, I thought, well, no one could identify the building, and I thought it must have been some type of a lean-to type wooden building attached to one of the brick buildings in town. Well, indeed, as we continued to research this, it ended up being the school building where they had been meeting, and that's how it all started. And then Phil Wyman came from California and tried to raise some public awareness, and then we had some people here in Genoa that were interested, and as well as Gaylord Sheldon, the fire chief, and he offered the use of the fire department to meet in, and Ellen Bergman and Marilyn Reeder. We have a couple of Sons of Union veterans that are really active in the whole thing, and we just all started working together, and we all kind of had to meet and become friends first, and away we went with this. And we come up with the name of Preserve Our Post. It was one of our members that came up with that, and we put it on a t-shirt, and so a public campaign was started. And 4 years later, we're going to sign the lease this Tuesday. The township trustees have sent the lease back to us with their signatures on it, and if my guys approve it, which I'm sure they will, we'll be the leasees of the building, and it's going to be as long as our camp is in existence, so I'm really proud of that.
You've done so much research. How did you get interested in the Civil War?
My father's great-great-grandfather on his mother's side was in an all-German regiment from Ohio. There were three all-German regiments in the state of Ohio. In the 37th, his company was Company C out of Wapakoneta, and that would have been the Kyle post, would have been their local G.A.R. post there. And he served in the Civil War, and I went to his farmhouse, which was built in the 1890s. It looks like one of those country estates with all brick, and he had struck oil, so he had more money than other people and built a larger home. And I went to the door and announced that I was his great-grandson. Well, they immediately welcomed me, and cousins I had never met. And I asked about him, and they went over and pulled open a drawer and said, well, you'll like to see this. And they had in a daguerreotype, that's the ebony black box. When I opened it, there was a glass photograph of him in there in his Civil War attire, carrying the gun and everything else. And they said, I said, well, I'm from Toledo. And they said, well, take it along and have a reprint made and just bring it back. And I thought, you've just met me and you're going to let me borrow this? And so I brought it back to Toledo, and my friend photographed it for me, so I've got a really nice photograph of Henry Doring. And that started my whole thing. I had to get my records from the government. I had to go to Princeton, West Virginia, where he was wounded in the Battle of Pigeon Roost. I had to see that. We had an oral family story, which that he was wounded while drinking water at a water barrel. Well, families in those days changed the stories around a bit. You always have to be careful, because when I went down there, of course I was in Southern sympathies, and the lady from the local historical society sold me their little text of the day's account of the battle. It was May 17th, 1862, where the night before, the 37th, the German soldiers had captured the Confederate medical wagon, on which was a barrel of whiskey. That night, the regiment became hilariously drunk, and the next morning they were marching down the road, and in the tall grass along the road were laying the Confederates in wait, and they opened fire, and my ancestor was shot through the right lung and was captured and taken to Richmond, and for the rest of his life always had problems plowing and doing farm work because of he was always short of breath as a result of his injury. Luckily, striking that oil was pretty good. So because of family history and because of his involvement in the Civil War, that's how I got involved.
Let's go back and talk about Mr. Wyman some more.
Okay.
You said he was instrumental in helping with the town hall?
Yes.
Getting the town hall constructed? Was that completed before he left the area?
Yes, he didn't leave, I believe, till like 1867 1887 to 88, when he wrapped up some of his affairs here. He still had family here in Genoa, and he may have some financial concerns still here, but it was advantageous for him to move out west. I think he first visited out there, came back, and then moved his family out there.
So his experience in the limestone business here
really helped him establish, actually it was with that knowledge that he received here in Genoa that he went out there and became even greater in his profession, establishing the concrete business, which was a brand new product at the time. I think concrete was basic around 1855, 1860 it started, and it only gained in popularity as a building material. And he was early out there, and he had a quarrying operation out there, and they were burning lime out there just like they did here in Genoa, which was, I believe, a drying process. And he really went down in the history books out there for his early community involvement in Los Angeles and the communities outside Los Angeles.
Is the quarry in the park here in Genoa one of his?
One of four, and his quarries. He and his brother-in-law, Leander Gregg, were in business together. And the library here has a nice collection of photographs of the Wyman and Gregg quarrying operations.
Do you know much about the town hall preservation efforts?
Just that it cost over $1 million, and that they had a grant, and Mrs. Bergman, Mrs. Aldo Bergman, led the charge to save the town hall, which also resulted in the town hall being placed on the National Register of Historic Places, as well as the town, the four-room privy, and the brick privy, and also the G.A.R. building was listed on there. So there's actually quite a bit here in Genoa that's considered very historic.
You mentioned that the men would have a morning drill, or the members of the G.A.R. post?
Yes, well, the big occasion was here in August of 1889, a brand new town hall, always something to show off, to the Ottawa County Soldiers and Sailors Association, which was a military and patriotic organization that was countywide, and all the G.A.R. posts in the county belonged to the military association, Veterans Association. Well, they had their annual meeting here in Genoa. The organization brought out 3 Union generals from Toledo, as well as lesser officers, and that morning, the G.A.R. men from all over the county assembled here, and in military precision marched into the town hall, probably had a little bit of discussion, a little bit of meeting. Well, it was time for the train to arrive here in Genoa, bringing the generals from Toledo. I can about imagine, I'm sure the private soldiers still had a lot of respect for generals, even at that time. And so they marched out of the town hall with their bands playing, and they marched down to the train station, which is in near proximity, and got the generals and the officers and headed back in for a day of meetings. And they would have been talking about some of those issues that we discussed that were going on in the county that affected the veterans. Later in the day, they had a sumptuous meal that was probably put on by maybe some local church ladies, because there was no relief corps at that time until the 1890s. Later in the day, they put on a play upstairs in the Opera House, and I believe the play was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then they were marched back in the evening, and it was probably very late in the evening to catch the evening train back to Toledo. And they said it was a great day here in Genoa. And one other time, about 5 years later, they came back again, but I have not read an account of that day.
So the morning drill wasn't something that they did every day. That was a really special occasion.
Special occasions. But the G.A.R. men loved to march, and it broke their hearts as they got older that they had to ride in those machines, as they put it. They wanted to walk. And Frank Wyman, it mentions in his book, during the course of his Civil War experiences, marched over 6,000 miles. Can you imagine walking 6,000 miles?
Do you know some of the battles that the group from Genoa were involved in?
They were in the Eastern Theater. Well, they moved them around quite a bit. I believe they were at Chickamauga in the Western Theater. The campaign that they were in North Carolina late in the war. And then Elliot lost his life in the Battle of Utoy Creek in August of 1864, and that was on the approach to Atlanta. So they were in the Atlanta campaign, and I believe the 14th and 100th were in with Sherman's March to the Sea. So they would have gone through Georgia and into South Carolina and North Carolina. Early on, he was in Kentucky. So I think they saw a good deal of, America's Civil War battles, at least the major ones.
In Frank's letters, he describes his last meeting with his brother. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, that's one of the things that really endeared this whole project to my heart, I think, was reading that. And he had not seen his brother for quite some time. And with these various regiments coming together, they were in close proximity, I believe just a couple miles apart. He learned that Elliot's regiment, the 100th, was nearby, and they needed a military pass to go back and forth between the regiments. Well, lo and behold, Elliot showed up in the 14th's camping area, and Frank said that Elliot looked so nice in his new suit of clothes because he had been home recruiting, and that the two brothers stole off to an area with willow trees with a little bit of a hollow where they sat down in there and had a little bit of a campfire and cooked some coffee in those metal cups that the soldiers always carried. And Frank said to Elliot that I understand that you've been rushing Confederate breastworks, and that was an absolute no-no because they were firing at you directly as you were doing this. Well, he said, if I remember the story right, I didn't ask to be a soldier, and if more men would follow my lead, this battle would be over sooner and I could be back on the farm. And they continued to talk a little bit more, and they broke apart. Elliot going back over to the 100th. Frank, a few days later, was in his cabin. They built these makeshift cabins to have a little better situation out in the weather than just a tent. And he was asleep, and he started to dream about Elliot and the 100th. And he saw the 100th being actively engaged in battle, and saw Elliot leading the charge and Elliot losing his life. And as he came to out of his dream, he heard the cracking of musketry and cannonading, and he ran out of the cabin only to find the colonel from the 100th coming into his camp with tears streaming down his face. And here he told him that they had lost Elliot between the lines. Indeed, it was the 100th that was engaged in the Battle of Utoy Creek already. And I'm sure to Frank that was a shocking moment that he probably never forgot his whole life. And Elliot always told people that if he was lost between the lines, that meant he was dead, because he would never just be lost. He'd always make it back. And a day or so later, they found him with 7 bullet holes in his body. And you could tell in subsequent letters that Etta, Frank's sister and Elliot's sister, was trying to get information out of Frank about Elliot and his last moments or whatever. And he said that Elliot was in a grave wrapped in his blanket with pine branches on the bottom and on top of him. And he called it moldering in the grave. Not the best situation that he could have been in, but the most honorable situation that he could have been in, because of the fact that he lived an honorable life and he had an honorable death participating in an honorable event, and that being the preservation of the Union.
Let's go on to a more cheery topic.
Yes.
Can you tell us about your activities with the Sons of the Union Veterans?
Well, we, like I said, our camp is what it's called today, was chartered out of Toledo in 1994. So we haven't been around but a little over 10 years or so. But in that 10 years, in 2002, we were voted, we were given the Abraham Lincoln Outstanding Camp Award for the entire nation. We did a lot of grave registrations for Civil War veterans throughout northwestern Ohio. We do cover the 16 counties currently in northwestern Ohio. For some reason, our side of the state doesn't have another Sons of Union Veterans camp. We're trying to give birth, so to speak, to one in Lima, Ohio. We have 5 men that are interested in forming one, but they should have at least 7 men to start. So we're hoping that they can get additional people interested, and that way we could break off a few of our counties and allow them to cover it. But we raised $35,000 and put the new granite statue up on the 1882 pedestal at Willow Cemetery, of which the Genoa Post was there on Memorial Day or Decoration Day of 1882 for the grand dedication. A lot of northwestern Ohio was there for that, quite an occasion. And Phil Wyman did have a ribbon from that day, which had Ford Post on it, which he gave to me upon his departure from Genoa, which one of my most treasured possessions. The grave registration I spoke of, they're trying to get our national organization has, these graves are all recorded and then put on a national website where people can go and research their ancestor to see what state or what cemetery they could possibly be buried in. But we have to actually go out and retrieve all this information from cemetery records or from actual recordings off the stones. And then they all have to be matched against the roster of the veterans that served in the war. So those are some of the things that we're doing, as well as just, we have 54 men, 4 of which have an interest in the Civil War, which are associate members. The other 50 all have a Civil War ancestor, either uncle or grandfather.
So you don't necessarily have to have a
Correct. You can join without. But if you're in the Daughters of Union Veterans, of which we have a tent, their organization's called a tent. They're in Fostoria, and they've been around since the 1920s. That one tent has. With the Daughters, you have to have a direct grandfather. That's the only way you can join their organization. So a little more difficult. But you do have Women's Relief Corps, Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic, and auxiliaries to Sons of Union Veterans camps that women can belong to that do not have to have such stringent requirements to join.
The reenactors that we see frequently, are they members of, do they have to belong to the Sons of the Union Veterans or?
No, they can be just people that have an interest in the Civil War. It's interesting for me that when you're wearing your Sons of Union Veterans badge, how I feel that they pay you an additional amount of respect when they see it, because some of them wish they had a Civil War ancestor and don't. So we work hand in hand together. I don't know what we do without them, for those men. And of course, we're always trying to find those that do have ancestry or do have that much of an interest to get them over to join our organization.
What's your office in the?
I'm currently the commander this year. It's a post that I can hold for a 2-year period, and then I have to surrender it to someone else. I have to be elected each year. And as far as we had discussed at one point about our meeting place, we are currently meeting in the town hall on the first Tuesday of each month at 6:30. The mayor has been very generous in allowing us to meet in the town hall. It's nice that we're able to sit in a building where Civil War soldiers actually met, and knowing that our building is directly out back, and while we're sitting there, a lot of times we're commenting that we can't wait till the day that we're able to meet in our own building.
I understand you found some interesting things when you inspected the building.
Oh, some very interesting things. As you step through the front door, and there's that coat room in the front, we noticed a small opening in the ceiling, kind of an attic hole, And it was really tight in there, but I said, boy, it was in late October. It was almost dark. We said if we just had a ladder, we could look up there, because we were trying to prove whether that was a Civil War building. Over in the corner was a very crude 2x4 ladder. Henry Bergman, Russell Buffington, Ellen Bergman, and myself were there measuring the building for the architect for plans. And Henry said, well, he's at the time was, say, 17. I'll go up there. I was like, what? I mean, that ladder doesn't look very good. Well, we put it up, held the ladder for him, the three of us on the bottom. Up went Henry. He's got a flashlight. And he just had popped through that hole. And I said to the other two that were with me, boy, it'd be nice if there was something that would prove that this was a G.A.R. hall. And just that quick, he handed down a very early G.A.R. star, which was a flag marker for the cemetery, a style I had never seen, very early. And he said, will this do? And we were like thrilled. I mean, unbelievable. He said, there's more stuff up here. What do you mean? There's boxes of stuff. And he said, papers, and there's flags up here. What do you mean flags? And he says, well, I'm handing them down. Here they come. There were one that said 100th reunion for the 100th Elliot's regiment. One that said meeting for the Grand Army of the Republic, G.A.R. men, for a fine smoke and a good lunch, patronize the G.A.R. booth, or stand it was, stand. And we found wooden cigar boxes with the tobacco still in them, where they had actually sold the cigars out of them, with lithographs in them that you'd never find today. They must have been easily from the 1890s to 1910. Over 900 letterheads from the Elliot, or from the Frank Wyman and Leander Gregg's business. A lot to do with the limestone, picking up limestone here in Genoa, and their mercantile store. We have the inventory rosters of the very first goods coming into Genoa for their store in 1867, and everything that they bought from people, as well as all the people they had credit to. So all those names, all those veterans' names are on there. I mean, almost everybody had a bill at their store. I think they were working in the quarry and probably did some trading with the store, kind of like a company store. These go from Townsend, Michigan to other things here in Genoa, Cleveland, Cincinnati. It's just amazing how many places, even back then, they were bringing in goods from. Fancy notions for ladies, sewing supplies, kerosene lamps, all that kind, anything that you would need in that time period, which gives you a real unbelievable look at what the people of Genoa needed in the 1860s and 70s to survive. And that was available for them to purchase, so it was quite a find.
What are the plans for the renovation of the post?
I said that the building's going to be moved back. We want to return the exterior and interior look so that when the public will step through the front door, it will look like a G.A.R. hall of around 1900. Potbelly stove in there, not a working one, of course. We're going to have central heat and hopefully some air conditioning. We're going to add an addition that will not be intrusive on the back, so that we have an additional room, like an office area, and an area for storage of our camp equipment. Of course, in the interior room, the large room, we'll have some muskets on the wall to allow people to see what it was like when the G.A.R. was there. And then we'll have all the officer stations, various tables set up in the format that we have a diagram of how it should be set up. And the men's chairs will be to the sides of the room for the membership. Of course, you have to have that door where you step down into the big room. You have to have the door closed, and then if guests or visitors or someone having business with our camp would come forward, they would be seated out there until we had opened the camp, and then the guards allows them to enter the room and be part of our meeting. So we've never had a door officially to close before, and you're supposed to show your membership card before you get your admittance. So we're hoping to eventually have a guard at the door. So
If someone would like to read more of Frank Wyman's experiences in the war, where can they find his letters?
Well, Ellen Bergman here in town has it. We have some at the Post. We'll be at Homecoming the first weekend in June. And I think that Ivy's Vine may have some here, a local business on Main Street. And if not, they can certainly call me, Jeff Eversman, 419-698-2096. I can get them a copy. And we'll have another book that myself and Larry Michaels put together on Ford Post, available for $10, which covers the soldiers from East Toledo all the way out Rocky Ridge. Anybody that belonged to Ford Post, the lines kind of come together, and some veterans belonged to one post early in time and to Ford Post later in time as they gave up their farms and moved in town. So there are some Genoa boys that are actually have a written account of their war experiences in the Ford Post book also.
And they can also come to the library and read.
Yes, that's
Frank's
right.
letters.
You have a copy here.
Do you have any idea of how much time you've spent in research over the years?
No, when I'm not gardening, I'm usually working on this stuff. It seems to be a real passion of mine. Almost sometimes it kind of overtakes you. Luckily, my wife puts up with me. The whole idea of what I'm working on right now is that in 2011, the nation will be celebrating the sesquicentennial of the Civil War for a 4-year period, and we want to be ready with a driving tour between Toledo and Cleveland, because not every family, due to the price of gasoline, and will be able to go to a Civil War battlefield, and we don't want the children not to be able to celebrate that period of time, and that's one of our purposes of the Sons Union Veterans is education. So there are a lot of memorials, cannons. 4 of John Brown's children, or 3 of John Brown's children lived at Put-in-Bay and are buried there. I mean, a man that was early in the beginning of the Civil War conflict. There's just so much here. Rutherford B. Hayes' home, Clyde McPherson's home, General Stedman's monument in Toledo, the G.A.R. Hall. I understand over by Cleveland there's a G.A.R. museum along the way. Cleveland has an absolutely huge memorial in their downtown square. There are other generals that are buried over that way. More than enough. So we're thinking of a bed and breakfast tour or hotels along the way, a 1 or 2 day trip. Of course, we'll include all the amusements in case you have family members that don't care about history and want to go to Cedar Point or the zoos or whatever, and maybe some good places to eat along the way. We thought maybe that people might just pick a brochure up and take a trip back in time.
Who was McPherson?
McPherson, James Birdseye McPherson, the highest ranking Union officer killed during the conflict. Almost the same time, just before Elliot lost his life. He lost his life in the Battle of Atlanta in July of 1864. Got a little too far out in front of his men and suddenly ran into a rebel skirmish line. They ordered him to halt. He didn't, of course, being a general. He wheeled his horse around and showed his backside to the soldiers, and one of them shot him in the back, which at that time was a horrible thing to do, being honor and chivalry and everything, to shoot a man in the back. But they did, and both Grant and General Sherman actually wept upon hearing the news of their close friend and fine officer. We really do feel, and it's been remarked many times, that they thought he would have been a presidential candidate and possibly a president had he lived.
In Frank's letters, he describes an encounter with General Grant.
General McPherson. Oh, General Grant also? Was that the time that he wasn't well? Yeah, he actually showed a lot of sympathy for him at the time. I was going to tell you about the fact that the remark that he found that he cherished the most was the time that McPherson said to him that you have wheeled your men in line without any loss, and evidently he got him into position, and no man was killed. And for McPherson to say that to him, he cherished that his whole life. But Grant did. He was sitting along the side. I don't know if it was his feet, if I recall the story right, if it was his feet or he was ill. And Grant showed a great deal of compassion for him. And Grant was kind of iron in his personality, but yet he did have some of that.
Yeah, I think he read that he arranged for transport for him to a hospital or a place that he could rest.
Oh, yes, yes.
And then inquired about him afterwards.
Yeah, I think
so many men to care about.
I think Frank had kind of a charmed life because he, throughout his whole life, showed up in situations just at the right time. He was sitting at a banquet one time in Toledo during the G.A.R. period after the war, and he was seated with the other officers in the front. I mean, to think that, he just always seemed to have the best of luck. So, would have been an interesting man to meet.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really fascinating to find so many ties to Northwestern Ohio with the G.A.R.
Well, thank you for having me. And, as always, come to our organization for information on the war, or you can always seek out your local library here at Genoa Library and read more about the Civil War period. It's alive and well, and we continue to learn and discover new things about it.